given that we have the two of you who have seen the rise of China's innovation ecosystem like few people in the world, I'm wondering if we could maybe just start by asking you, Neil, to just give a little bit of a perspective on the key factors in the rise of China's innovation ecosystem and sort of key milestones along the way that got us to where we are now.
Sure, thanks, John. I think China has really seen a great success in technology innovations. And when you look back the last 20 plus years, what are the key factors which drive this success? I think there's a few things. First and foremost important is the talent. I remember back almost 20 years ago when James and myself started C-Trip, it's not easy to recruit the very best talent from the top universities because people want to go join the large companies. Today, every top student from Tsinghua, from Beijing University, they want to join the best startups. And that is a huge change of mentality. We're talking about we have a strong group of founders and entrepreneurs which want to give a try in the technology startups. And not only that, we have the business leaders, but we also have a great pool of top engineers. Sometimes we try to call it the engineer bonus. And if you look around in the world, there are not many places like China. You have the the very large pool of the engineering talent. I think that's the driving force. Secondly, we all see the technology innovation has been driving many of those applications. Mobile internet clearly has changed the whole landscape of many business, and especially so in China. Thirdly, I would say China is a great market. We all know it's big. It's one homogeneous market. Not only that, China, to some extent, is even better fit for many of those mobile internet applications and innovations because the offline traditional business are underdeveloped. Actually provides a better opportunity for those disruptive technologies. E-commerce is a great example, right? I mean, we don't have the Whole Foods, the Costco's, the Walmart of the world, and China's offline retail is relatively underdeveloped. So that's why we see a very high penetration of e-commerce, and we see a fairly long list of names of e-commerce companies being successful. After Alibaba, there's JD, there's Pinduoduo, there's a VIP shop, and each addressing a different a user base and different product offerings. And thanks to to the fact that there's little on the offline side actually able to offer. Same for a payment space. I think clearly that China is leapfrog on the integration of online and offline payment with Tenpay and Alipay. Again, because the banking sector is not that well developed, gives opportunity for those applications to disrupt and become mainstream. I think so. These are the great opportunities for China, and China has over 40 cities with population over 7 million, and the same number is about 4 in the U.S. Now that provides great opportunity for the O2O services. The population density makes economics works for those online to offline services. And with all those factors, I think commercially there's got to be huge success created. So the last factor come to play, which I'm being very be part of, is capital. But capital came to play because the first three factors are well positioned there, and there's always going to capital chasing after great companies and great entrepreneurs. But at the end of the day, these three, the first three factors are really, I would say, the key drivers. And if I want to add anything, this is, on top of that, the whole society, and including the regulators and the government, has been very supportive. Why? Because those startups and entrepreneurship has creating social mobility in the country, and I think this is very important for China. I think we got a great education system that people can, through that, able to, having, a chance to have a great career. And at the same time, the startup scene has provided people to actually creating some great, career paths. And that's something, also true for US, but this has never been before being available in China back 20, 30 years ago. But it is been happening in China for the last 20 years. Yeah, and I hope that's obviously, will continue.
So I think it's interesting because I would even say that I went to China first time in 1997, and Jack was my tour guide, sent by the Ministry of MOFCOM. So I remember that there was no internet, really no internet. It was some academic networks, but there was really no internet in China in 1997. Yet I think by early 2000s, there is a fledgling internet industry. And I think we can all fairly say it was largely copycats. It was a lot of copying of existing Western sites, sometimes just the user interface. They have no idea what's behind the clicks, they have no idea behind it in the back end. They just copy the look and feel. And I think as we went through that first decade, through 2009, 2010, we started seeing that the copycats went away from trying to duplicate these services that are US, because they went from copying look and feel to copying business models. But I think right around the early 2011 timeframe, we started to see real innovation or real local kind of change. And maybe it did start, I think, as Neil said, with these O2O revolution because of the huge domestic market in China, that companies like Meituan, which started out as kind of a Groupon knockoff, to a much bigger now. They're essentially Yelp and Groupon and DoorDash and everything else in between. So there was this sort of sea change with business models, a sea change with consumer innovation, and it really turned into this very rapid change where today I would say the consumer internet business in China versus consumer internet business here, there are rough analogies. People talk about Alibaba and Amazon and Tencent and Facebook, but those of us and those of you who spend a lot of time in both countries or in China certainly, there are probably more differences than there are similarities. So the innovation, I think, really has become focused on the user base that they're trying to serve, which is the 700 billion plus consumers in China. And I would generally say that because of the China scale, because of not only the population but the consumers, the number of ride shares a day delivered by Didi, the number of meals delivered a day by all the meal delivery services, they're all orders of magnitude bigger than here. And so when you train your companies and your engineers and your innovation engine on those consumers, you are, I think, iterating at a very, very fast rate. That is, I think, very different from the dynamic in terms of the user base in the Western world. And so I would say, would you agree, right around that early 2011, 2010, there was that sea change?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I would say this. I mean, in the early days, I would not call myself copycat. I will use the word we learn a lot. Not because James and myself, co-founded C-Trip, and we learn a lot from Expedia.com. But, I mean, and over the years, you have to really revise your business model based on the local demand. For example, in the C-Trip, the first couple of years, you have the call center, which plays a very important role to addressing the consumer needs. Indeed, like what Jerry has been said, around 2011, when the mobile internet come to play, I think the average time span per person in China has been really catch up very quickly and overtake US in a very within very short period of time. And people started to look and say, hey, what are the unique product I should offer so that I could compete very effectively? Because remember one thing, that if you are a copycat, if we do use that word, then you quickly find out there's another 5 to 10 copycat competing with you. Now you better be original so that you can ahead of the game, right? So when we get into the space of ByteDance and Kuaishou and Pinduoduo, these are very original business models, right? I mean, when ByteDance were doing news aggregator, a lot of people have questions like, can this really sustainable, and whether this is really something the large company going to able to address, whether it's the search company or which coming from the large social network, and it turned out to be a standalone company, could be grow very rapidly. And same for its TikTok product, right? And again, it's original. It is really looking at this customer, say, what do they want? Because they are spending 3 to 4 hours per day on such an app, and they need a lot of interesting, entertaining content, to be to make up their time. And so I think all those has been come up. And same for Pinduoduo. I think it's an app obviously just created 4.5 years ago. Today its demand and market cap close to 40 billion. And we all saw that e-commerce are more or less done in China with Alibaba at the 400 billion. But this company has this new idea of social e-commerce, addressing primarily second-tier and third-tier cities, and they can really capture the customer in a very a quick manner. So I think these are all really China innovations. And if as far as consumer internet was concerned, I have to say that the China probably is more sophisticated than many U.S. counterparts. What is China is lag behind is on the enterprise side. We're big time lag behind. There's this 100 unicorn has been created in this country in the last 10 years on the SaaS enterprises. I don't know how many we have in China, maybe 5. And I think as
they're
far
probably
as,
all in your portfolio, so.
I hope, I hope. But and for deep tech, again, China is also lags behind, right? I always, I think I talk with Jerry about this. In the U.S., I have, you have OpenAI, we have DeepMind, and people talk about big dreams, AGI, artificial general intelligence. In China, I never found anyone come to my office and pitch for this AGI idea. No one is dreaming big as yet. Maybe that we don't have that infrastructure and talent ready yet. I hope one day someone came to my office and say, here's a crazy idea. I want to change the whole internet infrastructure or the IoT infrastructure. I hope one day we'll see that. But frankly, on that part, we have dreamed less.
So let me pick up on this issue about starting with the point where China was learning a lot from the U.S. in your terminology and adapting U.S. business models and technologies. And we heard about it this morning from Chinese retailers looking at Walmart. And now you're suggesting we're at the stage where China's doing its own indigenous innovation. And I guess one question is, will we get to the stage when the U.S. is starting to emulate Chinese business models and Chinese technologies, and where's that going to happen? And how might that happen?
Well, I think, in fact, many of those successful business models here in the U.S. are original to start with, but we do observe there is application here which is really originating from China, whether it's the bike sharing or whether it's actually the food delivery. I mean, obviously Instant Grab pretty much probably will try to learn from what Meituan has been done. And I think that's healthy. I mean, I won't call one country try to replicate or try to copycat the other, but that's really healthy competition in my view. And any company, if they're successful in one market, need to revise, really have to enhance themselves and to probably revise the product to cater into the other. And that is true for Facebook and Google. Is also true for ByteDance or Alibaba.
I will also just add that I think as China has shown, they were able to leapfrog because they didn't have the traditional brick and mortar logistics, and so they were able to use digital to build digital commerce first, and now they're back integrating, as they said this morning, but also it's from companies like Alibaba and JD, they're back integrating into brick and mortar, and the same thing could be said about, they never had landlines to worry about, so they went straight to sort of the mobile digital revolution. And if you start looking at other developing countries around the world, whether it's LATAM or Southeast Asia or Middle East and Africa, there is the potential for both Western technology and Chinese companies to go and help them leapfrog, the infrastructure they don't have, and I think it's, as Neil said, it's probably a lot of learning from both sides, and I think if you look at the short form video phenomenon that's happened in China, it's really starting to take off here in the U.S. So at some point, I think consumers and humans are human, no matter where you are, and I think what works really well in one country may get adapted and work really well in another country.
So I want to ask you about the rise of the largest technology firms, and I guess one way to set up this question is to say, 10 years ago, right now 7 of the 8 largest companies in the world by market value, market capitalization are big tech companies, 5 in the US, 2 in China. One of those companies was in the top 10 years ago. So that's just one measure of the pace of innovation and change. And I guess that raises two questions. One is, are we past the point where those companies can be disrupted? Will they still be there in another 10 or 20 or 30 years in both the US and China? And the second question, which follows from that, is how comfortable are we with that? And I think in the US, just to preface that, there's less public comfort than there was 18 months ago or 2 years ago.
Well, I think as investors, maybe Neil and I both, hope that we're hopefully that 10 years from now, there's some other company that we haven't, any of us haven't heard about, so we can be investing in them. I think having been through Yahoo and seeing, Google and Facebook, and it does feel like there is a opportunity to create large companies every so often. Whether that every so often is 10 years, 5 years, I'm not quite sure. And yet at the same time, I think the current large platform companies have, are really large. I mean, they are, have billions of users and very, very large balance sheets. I mean, they're essentially very large. If they're countries, they're bigger than most countries in the world. So, I think that you have this challenge of, do the benefits of these large companies, you getting your toothpaste in 24 hours or whatever, or your social media challenges, like the earlier panels, or the search benefits. I mean, are the benefits and the usefulness that these large tech companies are providing compared to the challenges and the perils that they're bringing? And it's well documented how privacy is an issue, elections are issues, fake news and content censorship are issues now in our own country. So these are very large societal problems that I think when people are upset, they go to their government and says, do something about it. And so I think there are many questions being asked by the government about how do these large platform companies become more responsible or are made to become more responsible. And I think that remains to be seen. I personally don't think just breaking them up is a solution, but I do think more thoughtful regulation is needed because it's really hard. It's really hard to say that these companies can self-regulate.
Yeah, I think that there are really probably 2 angles. One is if you look at those large companies, they have disrupted other players, so they become so big. So so that's obviously the positive side, and because of the industry is so much changing dynamics, they could also be disrupted by newcomers. But what happened, I think, if you look at the last 10 years, all the top company hasn't made much mistakes. They actually been done every single thing, almost every single thing right? Look at WhatsApp, YouTube, Instagram. They've all been acquired by those big companies. And in China, if you look at Alibaba and Tencent, they have been done great jobs. They're not just limited, themselves to their own so-called core business. They're expanding their business successfully. I mean, in the case of Alibaba, obviously, that you would never imagine, 15 years ago, they have been such a dominant player for cloud services in China. And they are actually aggressively pushing, the boundary. But if anything, if you look at the last 2 years, obviously people have been always talk about regulatory scrutiny at the U.S. companies using, data. It is happening in China. I mean, the last, 2 years, if any sort of step up in the regulatory, regime, and that's a key area. The regulator has been, checking to the, major companies, the startup companies say, are you, really leveraging your data in an appropriate way, or are you abusing your data? And I think this is all the right way to go.
So Jerry, you raised a topic that I'd love to push you on a little more, which was you talked about the responsibility that businesses have and skepticism about the ability to self-regulate. So one of the topics, of course, here that's been a big discussion here in the U.S. for a while, but particularly over the last couple of months, has been thinking about the social responsibility of businesses, and particularly who CEOs and managers are responsible to. Is it their shareholders? Is it a broader set of stakeholders? And you've been a public company CEO as well as board member. Be really interested to get your take on that discussion. And Neil, I'd like to hear from you. China has a very different history in terms of the corporate governance. It doesn't really have a tradition of shareholder control of companies in the way that the U.S. has had a lot of state-owned enterprises and now founder-controlled companies. But it has an important stakeholder that everyone acknowledges that's less acknowledged in the U.S., which is the government. So I'm wondering how you see the discussion in the U.S. and how it relates to any discussion in China about what is the responsibility of, who are businesses responsible to? Let's start with you, Jerry.
I mean, I think this is terrible to do in front of an academic audience, but I think it's either Socrates or Plato, one of these great guys a long time ago said, the defining moment of fall of a republic is when the distance between the rich and the poor become too big, right? And so this is not news when you talk about inequality. And I think we were talking about in the context of me sitting on the board of Alibaba and Lenovo, which are two Chinese companies with very global attributes. And in Alibaba's case, they would have regular presentations about their efforts in rural China. And they don't present it as a charity case. They don't present it as necessarily a money-making big strategy to go win big and create lots of profits. I think they present it as a matter of fact that they need to make sure that they don't let people behind. They don't leave people behind in their society. And so there's this, I think, just kind of a upbringing or cultural responsibility view that is, I don't know if it's unique to Alibaba. My guess is it's not, but it just seems like this is kind of what they do. And I contrasted to the recent, sort of the Business Roundtable letter where large companies in the U.S. are declaring that, the number one priority is no longer shareholders. They're going to worry about stakeholders and whether stakeholders are a number of things that they need to optimize around. And I do think that, given the last, 2019, so, basically 10 years of extraordinary, asset prices rising and companies having been the benefit of that, there is a huge question about, are corporations in America doing enough for society? And I'm not saying by any means that China's got it figured out. I'm just remarking that is almost a regular topic within the board meetings.
Yeah, I think large companies in China, whether it's new economy or old economy, realize that it's important as a platform company, as a dominant player, you have to fulfill social responsibility. And I think the founders have the responsibility looking after, obviously, regulatory concerns, but also going to have to looking at, the benefit and the consideration of the stakeholders, not just the shareholders. And I think for that purpose, one very prominent changes in the last 20 years is how those public companies are structured. I think super voting power is a very, very unique way to give the power to the founders to say, do look after the long-term benefit of the stakeholders, in my view. I mean, at least that's how the public trusts in them, right? And this happened in the U.S. first. I forgot when was the first company went IPO with that format. But then Hong Kong had followed through just 2 years ago. In China, we have the STARS market, the market for the so-called innovation and technology company. And people are having that kind of super voting power to the founder as well. And I think that's a very good thing because it is giving the management the power to really looking at the long-term benefit, including not just the shareholders but the stakeholders.
I'm reminded of to some extent of the comment that Matt Jenskow made at the end of the last session about the differences between autocratic governments and democratic governments, which it sort of depends on who the founder is who has control. But your point was well taken if the founder does have a great social mindset about advancing stakeholders. Okay, with that, I would love to open it up and take some questions from the audience and broaden the discussion. So when I recognize you, it would be great if you just said who you were and then asked your question. So start here.
Thanks for a great discussion. My name is Casper, a graduate student at FSI, Frida's husband, as previously mentioned. I just have to ask, since you're both here, does anyone trust Facebook with Libra, and is it really going to happen? And is it going to massively change the international financial system?
Well, I think the Facebook executives recently were quoted saying, they knew it was going to be really challenging, but even they probably underestimated how challenging it would be. I think a payment system that is built into messaging applications is not a new idea. I think the Chinese companies have seen how amazing that could be in terms of ease of use. So there's a lot of user benefit and product benefits for doing it. I think whether in the instance of this current incarnation, is it doable? It obviously has all the challenges you and I read about. I don't know anything in detail. I would just say, ironically, that and maybe Neil knows this better, but I think ironically the PBOC, the People's Bank of China, announced their own digital currency recently, and given the U.S.-China sentiments, maybe Libra or some version of non-Chinese digital currency is going to get more attention, more positive attention, because there is this already sort of a large counterpart in China that is rapidly expanding, and whether it's Tenpay or Alipay, is becoming very, very well used, not only by people in China but starting to grow, and there is no equivalent of that in the West. And so maybe, ironically, for that reason, Libra might get a more of an attention. But I think even then, it's hard to argue that in this current form I think it's going to have some challenges.
Right here.
Hi, my name is Lan Kang. I'm a DCI fellow at Stanford. I have a question. We're talking about innovation here, so new things are happening all the time. I learned that there's the first China Economic Forum last year. So my question is, just imagine that you'll do the same topic last year, and then now. Are there things that you are particularly interested in talking about today that you won't think about talking last year? Thank you.
Well, I think there are clearly more challenging environment for Chinese companies, especially the ones who have ambitions in U.S. And so I think the last 1 year or so, I never actually spend so much time to helping many of our portfolio companies to looking at it, what you should do to address the U.S. market. From a product perspective, they have the capacity to do that. if you look at DJI or ByteDance or et cetera. But this is a very different market. Not just you have to obviously try to address the consumer need, but you also have to communicate with the regulators. I think it's very, very natural. I mean, all the multinational come to China have to do that. And frankly, I think most of Chinese companies probably have not get ready for that. And they really need to really catch up and going through the learning curve. And I think if there's anything that I think that's the sort of, the change. And people are very concerned, and at the same time, people still want to expand their business naturally to, country like the U.S. And I think they, just need to get better prepared. And I think the good thing is that most of the Chinese, CEOs probably know U.S. than their counterparty know about China. They've been traveling to this, place so oftenly, right? In fact, I was part of this group, putting together East Meet West conference. I've been always, debating with the organizer whether we should have it in China. And we come to the conclusion that if you want to have this kind of conference in Beijing, it's hopeless to inviting a large number of American CEOs to be in Beijing, spend 3 to 4 days. But we can do that quite successfully here in the US. Those CEOs love to travel to the US, learn what's happening, in this part of the world, but I think today they need to do more than we're learning. They need to really get themselves familiar with the regulatory, environment. They need to get themselves familiar with Washington. It's a new, I think, task for them, but they have to deal with it. And on the other hand, I hope we can continue to see active cross-border investment and ownership, because that's the way, if any ways, that we can actually continue to engage China-US, and hopefully that we will not run into this divorce situation which referred by Candy last night.
Yeah.
Can I?
You want to add?
Can I pull?
Yeah.
Can I give my 2 minutes
Please
to
do.
Duncan? I saw your hand up. And just introduce yourself.
Thanks, Jerry. Duncan Clark, based in Beijing, and here, and increasingly experiencing the divergence, maybe divorce. We hear it at the infrastructure level a lot with Huawei, obviously, and security. We hear it maybe at the content level, as we heard earlier. The censorship maybe started the divergence because China initiated that with Google and so on. But we're hearing at the same time there's really interesting business models in China that Chinese consumers, and I experienced this living in China, it's more efficient now, daily life. There's less friction in buying things and getting around. And partly maybe it's, Neil, your point about the urban concentration. There are not that many 7 million cities in the US. But I think what's important is for the US tech's global influences, other countries are increasingly looking at China. And I was just in Peru, where they're looking more at the Chinese model versus the northern model that they just described. So how do you see divergence playing out, not at the political level, but in terms of this business model and from the consumer's perspective? And what is the cost of real divergence to the United States of really implementing this massive divorce or decoupling? I mean, do we even know the cost?
No, I think the biggest difference from last year now, and to Duncan's point, is I think we are headed towards this divorce, this decoupling on multiple dimensions, and yes, there was the internet, which I think I was one of the first companies that was essentially told that you can't really operate in China the way you want, so you better leave, and that's why we invested in Alibaba at the time. To now, if the infrastructure, like Duncan says, if the infrastructure on telco is gonna bifurcate, we're back to the GSM CDMA days. We have to take 2 phones or whatever. To supply chains, as we discussed earlier, and God knows what else in terms of bifurcation. It could lead to this point where consumers and people and cultures are not as in touch with each other, which I think would be a real mistake in terms of the challenge of misinterpreting, miscommunicating, and misperceptions that leads to bigger divides. And my sense is that things are going to get worse before it gets better, at least from the US perspective. There is a real momentum and energy by the government apparatus, not just in the administration, but I think all the government pieces to continue to disengage from China. And as somebody that is, sort of born in tech and born in Silicon Valley here, I continue to think innovation as a core American strength, and I feel this decoupling at some point will hurt our ability to innovate, and not only because of the trends that we're seeing in China that may get carried over to other parts of the world, but also just ability to access talent and ideas and a free exchange of knowledge. So I think it's a real worry, and I think it's a real worry for this conference and for this group of people to find ways to change the narrative, because the narrative right now is too easy for the people who want to decouple, right? It's really easy to, as Candia said in her book, take populism to nativism to isolationist, because it's always easier to just go back to your corner and say, we're going to be fine, we don't need to engage. The harder choice is to engage. The harder choice is, despite the dangers of, despite the challenges of wanting to separate, how do we work together? And right now, I don't think there's enough courage on our government to do that. But my hope is that if the narrative changes, the pendulum will swing back somewhat the other way. It's never going to be the same, even from a year ago. But I do think the new reality does require us to A, be courageous, but B, find ways in which we can change the dialogue.
Mike?
I've talked a lot, but can I ask a question?
Please.
It's your conference, you can do anything.
Mike Cookfall from Stanford. I mean, it just builds on this, but maybe to dig into it a little bit deeper. I mean, the Cold War analogy, one of the good things President Tessier Levin talked about it today, was that there was other societal actors, non-governmental actors, that questioned some of the assumptions that their governments made. And in the realm of physics, what Sid Drell did and Andrei Sakharov did to challenge what the governments were saying was, I think, vital to helping to wrap up the Cold War. So the first question is about technology. There's statements made by the U.S. government about Huawei. There's now statements made about subway cars in Chicago, about technological capabilities for them to gather technology. You guys know technology well. Is there a way for outsiders to interrogate those assumptions about technology, or is this, because it's all classified, we just have to take the CIA's word that Huawei can do what it can? So that's the first question. The second question is more prescriptive as well. And I just think, as I said earlier today, more information, more data, what is the economic effects of decoupling? That's on us, and we need to engage in that as an academic community. But the second question is about more things that could be done more outside of the box. And so let's forget about Trump for a minute, okay? Maybe that'll wrap up soon. I don't know. I'm not an expert on American politics, but just long term, because this is a decades-long dilemma we're talking about. Neil, you said something really interesting about cross investment, right? And if you look at some of the fantastic things that both of you have done, and Hank Paulson's coming here later, and the IPOs that he done with state-owned enterprises, really interesting business models that brought not just economic investment and opportunities, but information about SOEs in China. Now you take Huawei. We're told Huawei is an employee-owned company, it's not listed, and they have no external investors. So if I were, they don't listen to me, but they listen to you guys. If I wanted to change Huawei's image in America, maybe they don't care, so maybe they've just forgotten about this market. I would, get Hank Paulson or whoever is the right person to do an IPO and get a strategic investor that would become an ally of Huawei, and suddenly we would have a lot more information about what right now is a pretty strange, secretive company, at least to those of us who are not, expert on it. So why aren't they doing that? Just as one out-of-the-box example.
Maybe I'll, try to answer the second question.
Yeah, I'm dying to know.
So I think, indeed, I think if you ask the Huawei CEO, which I haven't, I guess he will say that they would have been done more, right? But I think that's a good lesson for many Huawei to be companies, which means that they have a global market to address. They better position themselves as someone who has transparent, who has great governance. Obviously, if they are a public company, that's even better. And that's how I think I'm being trying to advise the companies working with. Indeed, if you want to do business in the U.S., follow the local ways. And there's no difference than the American company come to China. And I think, and we all know what this country want from a governance and regulatory perspective. And I think the new generation of Chinese company probably will able to match that standard. And they should get ready not just from a shareholder from a business perspective, but get the team ready. A very international team, and have all the a right human capital ready to to addressing those needs. And I think Chinese companies are stepping up on their efforts. And I'm quite optimistic that some of those companies with those type of constraints and with those challenge might have a better chance to be successful on global basis.
I don't have an answer for you on the intelligence community and defense community, but I think I think there's been various iterations. For example, the Bloomberg article about Supermicro motherboards having chips on them, and I can't tell you for sure that it's hard to put one of those things on the motherboard and then put it in data centers and then feed data back. I mean, for every 100 people that you meet that says, hey, there's just very hard to do, maybe there's one person that says, well, I could do it, And so I just think that over time the incentive has to be more transparency. The incentive has to be, that there is, there's no incentive to do this other than, and so I think there needs to be more creative regimes to do that. And so it's more in the ways in which we govern these things, whether we govern, infrastructure technology or AI, because if you're trying to out spy each other or out game each other, there's always going to be some way, or somebody's going to say that's possible. Somebody the other day said, hey, Jerry, if you just leaked 1 bit every 10 seconds back to some mothership in China, you can get a lot of information and it will never be detected. So it's true. I mean, if somebody really wants to grab information from somewhere, you can get it. And I think when we make it a geopolitical issue, when we make it as government on government, there's nowhere to go. You have to cut each other off, right? And I think we're in that blunt instrument phase. And to your other point, which I think Duncan raised as well, which I'm fascinated, and I would love to know what the cost of decoupling is, and especially around technology, because I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg of talking about this. To truly decouple from China in the supply chain, especially around advanced manufacturing, and for China to decouple from the U.S., they still need our technology for a long time. It's economically very costly, and maybe that's a number that if it's fact and well researched, and it could change the narrative.
Mike, I think a skeptical view might say that more information won't be enough, because a lot depends on how people interpret that information, and a lot of that depends on what's the baseline level of trust that there is. And if the narrative in the United States, as it was maybe even as recently as last year, is China is converging in its values and its economy and in the way the government relates to business and so forth, then you're inclined to discount a story about China putting technology into exports to the United States. And if the narrative is very, very different, that deeply skeptical about the Chinese government and its role in the private sector, then you're inclined to interpret the stories a different way. And people can interpret facts in different ways, as we heard a lot in the last session. And that would suggest that just going public on New York Stock Exchange in and of itself will not actually make the difference. There's got to be more of a gradual buildup of rebuilding of trust. All right, we've got time maybe for a couple more questions, so let's. Okay. Oh, you next.
Hi, Jared Neal. Thanks for sharing. I'm Chow from Hong Kong, and I'm running. Well,
Yes, we know.
yeah, we talk about
Hong Kong, what do
yeah.
you call 10-year Hong Konger now?
No, I'm
I don't
not
know
going to
what's
bring
gonna
up the
happen in
Hong Kong topic again, but I'm talking about Chinese companies issue. As a CEO of a Chinese company, I'm here to learn, just as Neil just mentioned. We love to come here to learn about
Just
things.
don't learn too much.
Yeah.
Stay away from AI.
A question for us is, you guys witness a lot of successful Chinese company here coming to the market, like Alibaba, a lot of companies like Ctrips, but there are a lot of Chinese company actually having a lot of problems when they actually come over here, especially after listing in the US market. They find themselves not able to communicate well with the market, especially for some of the actual performance way much worse than in the private market. So a lot of them actually decide to go back to China. Do you guys have some advice, like what type of things the Chinese CEO should learn, not just about the model? Given the fact that my business has a really close comp here in the US, which give me a comfortable time when I'm doing roadshow here, but I'm worried, or I want to learn more in essentially what I should learn more about. How should we face the, like difficulty in communicating with the market here? Is there any missing part that should be careful? Especially, I think you two have a lot of experience witnessing a lot of things can be done better. Thank you.
I think there's one point I want to share. I think if you're looking at the companies who become public traded in the US from China in the tech space, indeed, there are a decent percentage probably has fall short of expectation from the public investor and hasn't been done that well. And one of the, I think, observation I have is that in China, the internet space in general is highly competitive, and I will argue probably even more competitive compared with the US. So one company could do well, in an extended long period of time, but the competition might, chips in, and it's not easy to stay in a strong position. And the large company want to get into almost every single corner of the whole internet, regime, and it's just tough. I think, sometimes I admire and jealous of the, the U.S. counterparts because there's less competition, especially company around the same models. So that probably explain, at least part of the reason why some of those companies may be doing well in the first couple of years after they're listed. And obviously there are always companies which are not executed well at all just because of internal management. But I would say that it is a brutally competitive market.
Hi. Excuse me. Sorry. Hi, my name is Peng Fei, and my wife is a JSB student, which is, I think, sitting over there. And we always had discussion about the company who went to U.S. market, like Luckin. And I said, I think this is it's a capital gain, and it's not making any profit. And also we talk about WeWork and VIP Case, the biggest online education firm in China. And she said, there's something going on that you may not know, and if you got enough capital, there's maybe some changes because of the capital. So I know woman always right, so just wondering, does she right this time, or it's just a capital gain? Yeah, thank you.
What's the question?
I mean, the company that went to market and they're not making any profit, like Luckin Coffee.
The questions about the prospects for companies that that have very high valuations but don't make any money, of which we can all name some.
So
in both countries. So
well, I think in China there's clearly have higher tolerance on those companies which need to burn a lot of money before they get to the right UE, unit economics. Some probably never get into the right UE. there's less tolerance here in the US, but it's looking more like China today for the US startups, I would say. Bike sharing is getting popular, and takeout players are also getting popular, and many of those are still burn money. But I would say in China, and partly, I refer to my early point, it's brutally competitive. And oftentimes the competition could last for many years without proper unit economics. And it probably less so in the US, whereby if you find one category of the players, they're not a long list, they'll be probably easy, and there's less sort of risk tolerance.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know if it's comparative. I would say, and this is not a reason, but I feel like the capital in the US was much more patient when you had, Uber versus Lyft, and both of them burn a lot of money. WeWork as a current example. Whereas in China, I agree with you. I think there are investors that guide them through the early stage like you and others, but I also think, in the last 10 years or 5 years for sure, there has been this major ecosystem supporter through Alibaba and Tencent. They're big investors in the space. And so when you have sort of major ecosystem players, strategic investors in the space, they tend to encourage more sort of competition at the expense of potential profitability. Whereas I think here, I don't know, for a while, I think large tech companies are heavy investors, but they backed off. And as sort of capital becomes a little bit more, less patient, shall we say, even in the private markets, I think. The public market, you're right, I don't think there's any patience for prolonged loss. But for sort of big platform companies that want to build themselves by spending a lot of money, private market used to be the way to go, but even that I think is getting less patient in the US.
So we're down to the last minute and a half, so let me see if I can get you guys to end us on a positive note, because we heard a lot about the rise of China, but also about this decoupling, which is, I think concerning and not the happiest narrative. So for those who want to see more constructive engagement between the US and China, what do you see as the path forward, whether it's for governments or for business leaders or investors? What are the areas where there could still be constructive engagement right now between the two countries?
I think when both parties try hard enough, there are still a lot of area for collaborations. Even pick the most sensitive area, for example, AI, right? Obviously, we know that there are many areas in AI is sensitive, and there's relates to securities and military and so on. But there's areas in AI, around AI. For example, Stanford's Human Centered AI Institute. I was discussing topics like, what is the impact of AI on society, on laws, on social ethnics and so on. And those, to me, I think there are at least areas that there are a great audience from China which would be love to be involved in that. So I think if we try hard enough, that there are areas even in the most sensitive sort of technology forefront that we can have collaborations and discussions which is and that mutually benefit.
Yeah, I think we need to take key areas, vertical areas, and look at them as opportunities. And they're probably in the sort of the global public goods area. Like, environment is a dirty word right now to the administration, but clearly environment is an area where if there is alignment on, China is a 30% emitter, and the U.S. is the other big emitter, and China is essentially saying, hey, if the U.S. isn't going to do anything on environment, why should we, right? So we have to think about that. We have to think about healthcare. There's issues around poverty that I think we can all work on, and within those areas, I think we need to figure out a way where we do let technology pass through. We do let talent and wisdom and knowledge pass through, and we do let sort of the free market be more competitive, even if you decide to close everything else. And I think finding those common areas of cooperation is more important than ever.
So one thing, just to pick up on the one thing you guys said in closing, I couldn't agree more with you, Jerry, on finding the specific areas for collaboration where there are mutually aligned interests. And Neil, you said something really interesting, which actually is one of my takeaways so far from today, was how, actually, although the US and China are grappling with problems somewhat separately right now, how similar some of the problems that they're facing are, whether they're the regulation of the big tech companies, the appropriate role for social media and the way to regulate that, whether it's business models, whether it's the capital markets. Very, very different, for example, than the Cold War, where the problems that the Soviet Union was grappling with were just fundamentally different problems than what the US was grappling with. We're trying to solve actually very similar sets of problems, maybe just from a different perspective. And it's really interesting hearing you bring that up, as there's that potential for a lot of mutual learning when you see two countries very advanced trying to deal with similar problems of development and innovation and so forth. So really fabulous takeaway for me from this session and the earlier ones. Thank you.